Evening, everyone. How's it going? It's John Fadul, and this is the second edition of the Geopolitics Q&A. First, I'd like to lead with thanking all of you who participated and submitting 8 amazing questions for me to respond to this afternoon. And the second thing is that I've changed up the video format a little bit. As all of you are pretty familiar, I have a physical headset with a microphone, but considering that microphone did a better job of recording the interaction between the microphone and my cheek instead of my actual voice, I decided to break out my old MacBook and use my AirPods instead, which have better microphone, ironically. So bad on you, Sennheiser, good on you, Apple. So we will begin very shortly. I'm going to share my screen so I can get access to my PowerPoint, which I have currently. Let me get that into presentation mode. Where is that button for presentation? Slideshow, play from start. Okay, Geopolitics Q&A part 2. So we'll lead with a question from Billy T. Actually, I'm gonna open my window. It's getting warm in here. As you can see, I'm wearing my winter plaid pants, so laugh at it if you want. So we'll continue now. What will Biden do with Iran now that we've killed one of their scientists? Will U.S. policy pivot to relying on our regional powers to check Iran so we can disengage somewhat from the region? I'm going to respond with that first question by saying we did not kill the Iranian scientists. The United States would not engage in that sort of blatantly clandestine operation. This is likely something the Israelis did or the Saudis did by using the Pakistani ISI, which are usually out for hire and the Saudis use pretty regularly. And so I just want to dismiss the fact that we killed one of their scientists. Does that mean we didn't have involvement? Of course not, but we likely just okayed it rather than actually committing the action. It's likely more Israel or Saudi Arabia because the United States does not want to be involved in the region and knows it can't really dislodge the regime in Iran. And so we have no reason to do that. US policy right now, even under the Biden administration, is going to try to be more reapproaching with Iran. The problem is that Israel and Saudi Arabia are making the sort of moves that would lead to a mutual recognition of each other and an unofficial alliance. And once that is cemented in a more rigorous structure, it's going to be a lot harder for the Biden administration to reapproach the Iran deal because there's going to be so much pressure on him from our traditional regional allies that will prevent us from re-entering it. And the second thing would be most of the key clauses of the Iran nuclear deal have already been violated by Iran or they've already expired. And considering the Iran nuclear deal was only meant to last 10 years, we are already in the 5th and 6th year of the deal, which means it's already heading towards a sunset. And so any form of a new nuclear deal would have to be basically negotiated with a new start point and new end point in mind, not building off the old structure that was largely agreed upon in 2014. And so the second question, what are we going to do? What are we doing about the PRC crackdown on Hong Kong, if anything can be done? So the United States has already sort of engaged in some preliminary sanctions against Hong Kong officials that have official relations with the Chinese Communist Party. And then the Congress has given the president authorization to leave the sort of American Hong Kong agreement, which allows Hong Kong to not only get access to American capital markets, but also to continue pegging the Hong Kong dollar to the US dollar. That was something that was largely being considered back in 2018, but it's something the administration chose not to do, mostly because they're in the process of negotiating the phase 1 trade deal. Does that mean it might not be used in the future? I think that largely depends on how open the Chinese government is with a Biden administration. Because if a Chinese government is more openly hostile to Biden, even though Biden was the more preferred candidate out of the two, if the Chinese government starts on the wrong foot, then even if Biden wanted to be conciliatory, the bipartisan consensus in the legislature, the Senate, and the Congress is largely anti-China. So his ability to be conciliatory is not only dependent on what the Chinese are willing to do, but also what the Congress is going to allow him to do. And the third question is, what does the PRC make a move on reclaiming China and Taiwan, if ever, and how will the U.S. respond, if anything? Or does the PRC wait until they have a better Navy, potentially reserve currency status, whatever that is, before taking Taiwan? So I talked about this in the first Q&A a considerable amount. So if you want to get a more broader answer, I'd recommend going back to that one. But I will answer it again, just in a shorter form. The first thing I'm going to say is that China will never get reserve currency status. They need to have an open capital account. Their currency needs to be used in settling transactions more. And there's just a lot of things that the Chinese need to do to have reserve currency status that they just can't do. And one of them is being a predominantly consumption-based economy. And considering less than 40% of their economy is consumption-based domestically, with the other 60% being export dependent, that's not a way to maintain a strong fiat currency. The reason why the American currency is as stable as it is because we can predominantly consume all the goods we produce domestically. And what goods we can't produce are imported directly from our trade partners or China. And so without that strong consumption base, which can basically match American industry one for one in consumption, it's very hard for the Chinese currency to sort of build that sort of resounding level of stability, which is crucial for a fiat-based system, which is based predominantly on trust in what benefits does that government have compared to its counterparts. The Taiwan issue largely depends on how cornered the Chinese feel. Since Biden looks like he's going to be the official president-elect after December 14th, that likely got pushed back, possibly to as soon as 2025 or as late as 2030. But if Trump wins, if he runs in 2024 and wins in 2024, I think that could likely be a lot sooner. It just depends on how cornered China feels, and that involves being cut off from its primary export markets, being blocked from accessing cheap capital from abroad in the form of euros or dollars. And so I can't get a definitive answer on that, but the PRC will make a move on Taiwan. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Hopefully that answered your questions. If not, feel free to comment below and I'll respond in the comments. From Gerard, whose side is Germany really on, and what is their real geopolitical agenda? So Germany, since the end of the Cold War, which would officially be 1991, has sort of been doing its own thing. And we saw that almost immediately because what a lot of people forget is that the Germans used to have a very robust army of nearly 400,000 men with tanks, a fully functional Luftwaffe or Air Force, and then a very fully functioning and competent Navy. But when the Cold War ended, they took advantage of what's called the peace dividend, where they considerably cut back defense spending and then allowed that money to be freed up in the private sector by cutting back on government spending. And so Germany has been sort of straddling two key interests. And one of those is pursuing its European interests while at the same time maintaining a good relationship with the United States. And so that's why we've seen sort of piecemeal placations to the Russians in the form of Nord Stream 2, their natural gas pipeline that was meant to bypass Belarus and Ukraine. And then Angela Merkel's very good relationship with President Obama. Both of those things should be counter to each other, but they weren't, mostly because the Germans are straddling the line. And so their geopolitical interests are predominantly serving themselves, but when push comes to shove, if that means having to make sacrifices to please one of those two interests, they're willing to do it. They just don't like to do it. And so Trump being extremely hard on Germany for not increasing defense spending actually got results, mostly because he threatened to leave NATO and people didn't question that commitment to leave NATO if they didn't increase defense spending. And so the Germans gave. But with Biden coming in, they're likely to retrench on that issue again and possibly not meet their defense obligations in the future. They are mercantilist, hiding behind a cheap currency because of the economic troubles of Southern Europe. That's broadly true. If Germany was independent of the European Union, the theoretical Deutschmark would be an incredibly strong currency, which would make basically their exports completely non-competitive. We tend to call that Dutch disease, and mostly because the Dutch in the 80s used to be a huge importer and extractor of natural gas and oil, but they accumulated so much capital and currency that the Dutch currency just went through the roof, and it made their exports completely uncompetitive. And so the Germans would suffer from Dutch disease if they were ever to leave the euro. They import their road energy from Russia, which the US hates. That's true. They import their cheap labor from Turkey. Also true, but they also hate it too because the Turks are incredibly nationalistic people. So every time Erdogan comes to Germany, they tend to have Erdogan rallies. And so it has sort of been a double-edged sword in that they like the cheaper but equally competent labor they can get from Turkey, but they also hate it because it has the potential to create domestic instability. They skimp on defense spending, international responsibilities by hiding under the US defense blanket, and mouth all necessary words to kiss up to the American power while avoiding actual spending of money. I answered that already. I agree. And they are sort of the main backers of the technocratic. I wouldn't go that far, mostly because the Germans are so meticulous about avoiding the word fascist and everything. I would agree with the technocratic thing. One of the things that became very predominant after the end of the Cold War was the management by experts. And so we see that in the United States. So doctors like Dr. Fauci have the ability to dictate economic policy, even though Fauci, while probably making the right medical diagnosis, is making the wrong economic diagnosis, which we've seen the results. And so the Germans in general are definitely more the defenders of that sort of leadership by experts, mostly because the belief in Germany in government's responsibility and individual success is so considerably greater. I think Pew Research poll did a survey in the mid 2000s about this question, and they found that 80% of Germans believe the government has some responsibility in their own personal success, while in the United States, that's like a 60% move in the opposite direction, where less than 20% believe the government's responsible for their personal success. And so the Germans in general have a higher degree of trust in institutions, mostly because German history has traditionally been managed by competent institutions, because that's just how they had to manage, mostly because Germany wasn't a united country until after 1891. And so when you have such small competing interests against each other, you need to have very competent institutions. The Americans, in comparison, didn't have their first fully paid and funded road until the mid 1800s. And so our institutions tend to be a lot slower, staffed by regular people more than technocrats. That has sort of changed a lot recently, which is why the results have been sort of mixed and poor. But in general, I do agree with the underlying thesis, but I wouldn't characterize it as being that extreme. Most things aren't nearly as extreme as people think, but they're also not as simple as what people think either. Hopefully that answered your questions. If not, like I've said for other people, feel free to comment below and I'll be happy to respond to your questions. Lisa Gee, again, great question. I had to think a decent amount about this one. What's a current news media narrative that you believe is misguided or misinformed? Please discuss the predominant news viewpoints along with the counter viewpoint. If you like the saying, I'd love to see this become a regular segment of future videos. Thank you so much. So it's hard not to, it's a good question. The problem is that when you start going counter narrative, that's when you start openly being counter narrative. That's when you start getting perceived as being openly political. So one of the hot button issues right now is the election. The media has certified the election for Joe Biden, while Republicans claim it's not done until it's over. The media has no right to determine an election. They can call it whatever they want, but they don't have the constitutional power to dictate the election outcome. That's mostly down to American institutions. So on December 14th, the electors meet, and constitutionally, they aren't bound to respect state level national popularity contests. And so technically, your state could vote one way but your electors could vote another, and that would be legal. That's largely a precedent that hasn't been respected since largely the 1890s, as many states started attaching laws dictating that the popular vote will determine how electors are selected in the state houses, which, if ever taken to court, would probably be declared unconstitutional. But because that has never been legally challenged, because it would be legally, not legally, it would be very politically unpopular, since there's such a emphasis on popular mandate and popular will via the vote. A system that is supposed to be semi-democratic but also semi-authoritarian, that's the American Republican system, has never been characterized as being a semi-authoritarian, a semi-free democratic system, mostly because it's hard to be the champion of democracy when democratic institutions aren't necessarily prioritizing your constitution. The Senate, for example, isn't supposed to be democratically elected. It was supposed to be selected by state houses at the local level, and then the state house would select 2 senators and send them to Congress. I believe either the 18th, I think the 18th Amendment of the Constitution changed that to where it's dictated by popular vote. And as a result, I think things got a lot more messy because the way the founders created the Constitution was that it's supposed to be a balance between authoritarian tendencies and democratic will. And so with those two constantly checking each other, it was meant to prevent mob rule. And so December 14th, the election could easily go the opposite direction of what the media wants you to think. That's not a very, very politically popular thing to say, but it's in the realm of possibility. If state houses feel that there was chicanery in local elections, then they have the constitutional obligation to check that corruption at the local level by appointing electors to the party that discriminated against, for the lack of a better term. And so that's one thing. And then the second one was that this election was free of abnormalities and possible corruption. In the United States, there have been plenty of elections that have been challenged in courts that have been deemed frauds or weren't challenged based on that premise. Lyndon Baines Johnson, former House Majority Speaker and then President, his first election to the Congress was very broadly deemed illegitimate election, but the Supreme Court decided that it wasn't going to rule in on the matter. Bush v. Gore, another example that has been considered by Democrats as a stolen election. The Supreme Court chose to intervene on behalf of that case. And I can name a couple examples off the top of my head, but most elections in this country aren't free of corruption. If you're a local election head, you're very tempted to do it if you feel like you can't get caught. And in this election, because there was such an emphasis on mail-in ballots because of the coronavirus, a lot of state level party leaders challenged the governorship in a lot of these swing states and said, well, because of the virus, we should have the ability to ignore traditional election protection laws. And that's what we've seen occur in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, which were all considered swing states in this election. Does that mean that fraud occurred or didn't occur? That's going to be largely up to the courts and up to the electors on December 14th. But those laws were declared void for this election, essentially. And so there's a lot of things that happened in this election that haven't happened in other elections. And so those are probably the two off the top of my head that I can think of right now that are sort of counter narrative. And then hopefully that interests you a bit. But in general, when you're looking at news stories, I try thinking about it this way. Things are almost always a lot more complicated than what the headline is telling you. And whenever there is a complicated story that they're trying to simplify, they're likely doing it to be purposely misleading, and the complicated situation is likely a lot more simple than it actually is. One of those stories, for example, would be a headline published by the Washington Post a couple of months ago, where they polled Hispanic communities on what they want to be called, either Hispanic or Latinx. And the headline says, conflicted polling shows there's a divide between those who want to be called Latinx and Hispanic. But when you look at the poll, and this is the actual result, 99% of Hispanics approved the term Hispanic, while only 1% approved of the term Latinx. And so you need to be very careful when reading headlines and just hunt for the data and make sure that it backs up the claims that are being made by various news organizations, and don't trust anonymous sources. If you put in anonymous sources in an academic paper for a professor, the professor would laugh at you and then fail you in a class. And that's in general where my thoughts are. It's not a clean answer, mostly because it's a broad question and I'm trying to think of stuff that isn't too controversial. And so hopefully this helps you a little bit. If not, leave me a comment and I can hopefully give you a better answer. So moving on. Jeremiah, what are the major risks in India? The major risk in India is that of it being compared to China, mostly because there's a lot of hope that because India has taken considerably longer to start the development process than China did, because both economies entered the post-Cold War era relatively at the same time. But China opened its markets a lot faster than India. And so there's the hope that India can replicate China's success in that being a cheap place for labor, for low additive manufacturing, and a large consumption base. So I think the biggest risk is that you have your hopes up that it's going to replicate China's success. I don't think that's going to be the case. But the more immediate risk, rather besides hopes, is probably the banking system. The banking system in India is highly leveraged and very exposed. And so there was a story published by Bloomberg recently talking about the Indian banking system, where it said, while the major banks were able to acquire more capital through international markets because they were able to issue new debt with higher yields, and people are chasing yield right now. So it's pretty easy to get capital if you need it. But the smaller banks in India that serve local communities are having a hard time getting that same access. And so a lot of them, every bank in India is highly leveraged, but those that are big conglomerates tend to have access to capital markets while the smaller ones don't. And so there's the potential for a local contagion, and that if the situation doesn't get handled quickly, it could become national level contagion, which is where you get the credit correction event. And India is overdue for one. It's just whether or not it happens when it coincides with the sort of coronavirus economic consequences, or it comes sometime down the road. Because a lot of the things that traditionally happen in economic crises seem to be suspended for this year, most because there's been so much money thrown at the wall that a lot of traditional indicators and sort of actions that would have occurred even in 2008 aren't occurring right now. And so I think that's one of the major risks. What are the major opportunities in India? India has the geography and the population to support a consumption market of between 150 and 200 million people, of the same level of middle class consumption potential that the United States has. Obviously, that would be half the country of the United States in that case that has the same consumptive ability. But that's still considerably better than what Europe is offering, or Russia is offering, or what China is offering in the long term. And so India has the potential to be a robust consumption market in certain localities. But one of those risks is that if the Indian central government becomes more centralized and more controlled and more competent, that a lot of these poorer communities and sort of these geographically disadvantaged areas will start calling on the central government to levy higher taxes to get more social benefits and social disbursements to these underprivileged areas. And that could largely cause the Indian middle class to move elsewhere. And so it's sort of a mixed blessing where they have this consumption market, but you got to hope that the central government remains weak to where these local provinces will have the most amount of power to dictate how well and how business friendly they are, but also have the ability to protect themselves from federal level tax increases that would see capital being reallocated to less effective or growth related areas. And so what's your view on lithium? It's a kind of a jokes question because we were talking about this over text the other day of that video that Ed Harrison did with the guy who was the lithium bull. Um, I think the lithium market concerns me, because if you actually look up the data where all the sources of lithium that can be mined, the three largest concentrations of lithium are all in South America and what's known as the lithium triangle. And so the lithium triangle is the countries of Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. And the country with the largest reserves are in that order. And so when we start looking at these countries when it comes to business friendliness or friendliness to foreign investment, Bolivia is almost always at the bottom of the list. Argentina is improving, but it's on the bottom third of that list and slowly making its way to the middle. And then Chile has traditionally been in the top third of business friendly countries. The problem is that with the recent political instability, it's looking like it's going to become a lot less friendly to business investment. And when your largest reserves of lithium are in those three countries, you're going to have a supply problem. And the concern I have when people are pointing to China as a source of lithium is that China has one of the smallest reserves of lithium to access, which is why they prevent it from being exported, because they wanted to serve only domestic interests for as long as they can before they have to start tapping international markets for lithium. And so people who think that China's the future of electric cars and for lithium, in the short run, they might look that way, but in the long run, that will pan out to be a completely different story and likely counter to the narrative. And the other thing too is that when you're looking at the electric car space or just the electrification thing and deal and overall, is that the largest consumer of lithium isn't the EV makers or the electric car makers, it's the oil industry. The oil industry uses what's called as lithium grease for a lot of their large platforms for drilling, traditional drilling rigs and offshore oil rigs as well. Not so much for fracking in the long course of the process, but the initial drilling is done with this process. And when a lot of these rigs are billions or hundreds of millions of dollars, these oil companies are willing to spend whatever dollar, how much money, whatever money it takes to get a hold of lithium grease. So it's a small input cost that's just taken a sunk cost. And so when you're competing, when you have a large consumer of lithium that doesn't care about the price, and then a smaller market that is really dependent on cheap access to lithium, like the EV space, you start running into considerable supply management issues. And then the only way you can sort of address those issues is if you start increasing the extraction of lithium. And when the largest reserves of lithium are slowly being sort of cut off from international markets, and the only other possible market for lithium is sort of blocking international access from its market, like China, that's where you start running into problems. So I think the bullish narrative on lithium is not nearly as real as people think, mostly because it's reliant on a bullish China narrative and a bullish Tesla narrative. And both of those cases are severely flawed. In the short run, you could probably trade lithium and make a decent amount of money since the fundamentals don't really matter right now. But when fundamentals start to matter, because this can't go on forever, the lithium case is going to be brought back down to earth. Then he asked me about the BlackRock geopolitical risk indicator. I think it's trash. This is what happens when you have poli-sci students that have too much free time. They like to chart everything. And the problem is that you're trying to turn intangible scenarios into tangible graphs. And so a lot of these definitions are very subjective. And so, for example, the European fragmentation risk is high, which I agree with. But the way it just seems to go up and down seems completely arbitrary, because I'd say that it's been consistently high, almost permanently high since Brexit. But there's a lot of press and paparazzi that's roughly pro EU, and so progress, which isn't progress, is made to look like progress. And so, this is where I'd advise doing your own research over doing letting someone else make your charts for you. It's very subjective. I wouldn't use it. And if you could pick one movie and one meal, what would it be? My favorite movie is this sort of English indie film called Sunshine. It's a sci-fi film with a great music soundtrack. I highly recommend it. And one meal, Five Guys burger. Five Guys makes the best burgers. I just wish they weren't so darn expensive. Thanks for your questions, Jeremiah. If you have any questions, just text me. Now, John Sunheim has asked me a couple of questions. And so I'll try to answer them here, and they're a bit out there. If Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs flee to New Zealand during a U.S. disruption, what would be the industry consequences be? Not going to happen. One, New Zealand doesn't have the workforce size to supplement all their needs. And if Silicon Valley tried to in full move its entire American work base to New Zealand, they'd very quickly realize there's just not enough real estate for them. And so living costs in New Zealand would skyrocket. And then New Zealand's ability to provide food and access for all these new people would probably cause some political instability as well. I think they'll continue to buy property in New Zealand, like personal property, because I know Peter Thiel bought a decent amount of property in New Zealand, but they're not going to be moving a large portion of their businesses over there. It's not going to happen. As much as American businesses like to sort of trash the American business climate, it's still the best show in town, regardless of what people think. It may not be as great as what people want, but it's still the best show in town. How much gold or wealth is being taken to New Zealand? None. It's a lot of this New Zealand talk. I wouldn't take it seriously. Like I said, America is still the best story in town. I think New Zealand would be a great place to retire. It's quiet. It's isolated. The political intensity is not nearly as strong as it is here in the United States. The Kiwi election that happened a couple of months ago was so calm. And I think everyone just didn't care about the outcome because it's just calm. So I think it's a great place to live, but I don't think it's a great place to do business. Not for the large Silicon Valley conglomerates. Can New Zealand economy ever function independently of Australia or the rest of the world? No. They could definitely produce enough agricultural goods to provide for the domestic needs, but they don't have access to raw mineral resources that's necessary for what's known as an autarkic economy, which is an economy that is self-sufficient. The Soviets were barely able to do it, and the Americans have probably done it the longest, mostly until the early or mid 1900s, where we became more trade based. But you really have to have the resources and of an entire continent that isn't shared with anyone else. And if it is shared with other nations, it has to be weaker powers. And the United States is the only one with that kind of geography. The Canadians and the Mexicans are never going to invade the United States. And so the United States, again, is the only show in town. What do you see as China's most sensitive territorial claim? Could Taiwan internal events set China on an unstoppable course for war? Or claims in the South China Sea of any consequences? China has three sensitive territorial claims: Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang. The most sensitive of those is probably Xinjiang, because it is a multicultural narrative for the West. And the West likes to pride itself on multiculturalism. And when these societies see China virtually wiping out a small but significant minority of Uyghur Muslims, it becomes a very, very powerful political talking point. And it's a way to isolate China economically and socially without actually using economic sanctions. And so that's probably the more sensitive of the territorial claims. Tibet has always been sort of a messy province for them. They've never really been able to control it, which is why you've seen a sort of military buildup recently, and the emphasis on building new Belt and Road Initiative projects like dams, mostly because they want to cement their claim in the region, and it's one they've never really been able to keep within their realm of their control. Taiwan is their least sensitive, but it's arguably one of their more important ones, mostly because Taiwan, being a free and independent country, is a threat to Chinese trade. And so Taiwan, partnered with a stronger power like Japan, has the potential to crater the Chinese economy overnight if they were to blockade all major Chinese ports, or even just lock them within the first island chain. And so if there's a war with Taiwan, well, when? Because it's going to happen. Taiwan's likely to partner with Japan, India, and Malaysia. I think the United States is going to want to stay out of that role, because it would be two nuclear powers going against each other, and that's a recipe for bad news. But that doesn't mean the Americans are going to sit by and not do anything. They're just going to sell weapons to Japan, Taiwan, India, and Malaysia, which we're already see the Americans doing. Um, China has really no claim over the South China Sea that is really enforceable. The only reason why they've been able to get away with it for so long is because the United States hasn't really sort of challenged them in any way. Why? Their Navy is not competent, it's not experienced. In any battle of the Chinese Navy versus the American Navy is one-sided. American wins every time. And so it's not of any consequence, but it is a nuisance. Hopefully that answers your questions. And if not, leave a comment below and I will get back to them. Master of money. Again, this is where controversy starts to happen. Is the gold standard coming soon for international trade? Who's going to dictate the terms if the big boys come to the table and decide gold or different neutral reserve currency as an asset or settle balance of payments difference in trade with smaller countries who don't have any gold adopt Bitcoin as a reserve asset or have a seat at the table with big boys? Okay, so there's a couple of narratives I need to sort of disprove here. And the first one is that any system that has reserve currency is not a decision that is sort of bring everyone to the table and have them debate over what the system should be. Bretton Woods was very one-sided. The Americans brought all of the surviving democratic powers to the table at Bretton Woods. And the expectation by many of these ambassadors that were summoned was that the United States, being the sole untouched democratic superpower, that the Americans were going to force them to become captive markets, where Americans would sell their goods in abundance into their markets, and they wouldn't have the ability to compete. And so when the United States dictated terms that weren't like that, a lot of people were surprised. And the terms of Bretton Woods were very simple. The Americans would open up their markets to their surviving democratic powers. They would reduce trade barriers. They would give them access to American capital. The Americans would rebuild Europe and rebuild their militaries and then provide unfettered access to international shipping lanes in the ocean, which in the past wasn't something that was guaranteed. You needed to have a very large Navy to guarantee trade access. And then the only thing the Americans asked in return was that the Americans would dictate what their defense policy was. And so as a result, the Americans were able to rebuild Europe and have a massive army in Europe, in West Germany, to defend against the Soviets, while the Europeans were able to rebuild themselves without becoming captive markets and having businesses that could compete directly with the Americans. Japanese conglomerates such as Mitsubishi, Honda, and Nissan are good examples, and German traditional giants such as Krupp, Audi, and Mercedes are the sort of competitors to American equivalents. And so the Americans dictated the system, the Americans funded the system, and the Americans maintained the system. It wasn't this kumbaya moment where all nations came together and decided that this is how it was going to work. And the reason the Americans were able to do this is because they had the most gold, they had the strongest economy, and so they were able to convince everyone to use the dollar. When it was pegged to gold, $1 for every, I think it was 35 ounces per $1, if I remember correctly. The problem with that system, and the system was going to fall apart eventually, was because if the Americans engaged in prolonged deficits for too long, and unfortunately that's what the Bretton Woods system was designed to do, basically guarantee the Americans would continuously run trade deficits by importing goods from surviving democratic powers. The Americans would start printing too much money and wouldn't be able to maintain the peg. And so Nixon in '72 unilaterally ended the gold peg, and then all of the dollars that all these countries were holding that used to be pegged to gold no longer were. And because there were dollars everywhere, the dollar continued to be the reserve currency. And the Bretton Woods system is coming to an end, mostly because the Bretton Woods system was designed to defend against the Soviets, and the Soviets are gone. And the Russians aren't the Soviets, they're a much weaker power. And China isn't the Soviet Union because China's demography is horrendous. Their geographical strengths are bad, and their ability to project power outside of China is very weak, unlike the Soviets who had the ability to project power. And so the Americans are walking away from the system, and without a singular power to back up a unitary system, the system sort of falls apart on its own. And so this talk of a new Bretton Woods is sort of a very dishonest retelling of history where everyone came together and decided on something, and that's not true. A future Bretton Woods would need to be dictated by the United States, funded by the United States, and supported by the United States, because we're the only consumer market that exists. We're still the largest holders of decent capital. There is no alternative. The Europeans, they can't provide an alternative. The Germans could, but if the Germans were to become an independent country again, the currency would be so valuable they couldn't export anymore, and so their economy tanks. No one trusts the English anymore. Whatever goodwill they had or trust in English institutions has been tossed aside because Brexit has been handled so poorly. And the Brexit system is going to take away the only sort of quill in their hat, which is the euro dollar market, and their ability to straddle the international financial system and then the European financial system. That's going away as well. The Canadians run a tight ship, but you can't run a reserve currency on 30 million people. The Aussies and the Kiwis both run tight ships as well, but you can't run a international currency system based on 45 million people. And it just there is no alternative to the United States. The United States is the reserve currency, and it will be the reserve currency probably for the next until the next century. Bitcoin and gold. Gold will always be a source of value for people who want to protect money in constrained times. I think that's a good use for gold. Will it be a reserve? I don't think so. There's too much temptation in governments to print money in order to meet needs in short-term events. The United States printing $10 trillion this past year to backstop the economy is a perfect example. And inflation still isn't over 2%. That's amazing. And there's not enough gold in the world to sort of allow for that heavy and very liberal use of fiscal spending and monetary spending to exist. Even when gold was the reserve currency, there were still competitive devaluations in the 30s. And that was one of the things that central bankers really hated, was because when every country all of a sudden became super protectionist, they started competitively devaluing against each other. The English did it first. They devalued the pound by like 15%. And then FDR said, okay, we're not going to fall behind the English and let them get a currency advantage. We'll devalue the dollar by 25%. And then the French, always being notorious for devaluing everything, they just went crazy with it. And so even when gold was a reserve currency, it wasn't permanently a reserve, because when it was too inconvenient to have gold as the reserve currency, they all of a sudden went back to greenbacks and started printing money again. So this idea that gold is sort of the panacea to all problems, I think, is a bit misleading, because we're human beings. We don't stay committed to systems if they're inconvenient. And the dollar is just so dominant that even if it is an inconvenience, it sort of overrules all of that. Bitcoin, Zero Hedge released an amazing chart the other day, and it showed Bitcoin's price compared to US federal interest rate policy. And Bitcoin tanked in 2017. And ironically, that was when federal interest rates were at their peak. But when the Fed started cutting interest rates in 2019, Bitcoin got a new lease on life, and we saw it spike really hard. And so Bitcoin's rally in its price is not because of its fundamentals. Bitcoin's rally is predominantly people chasing yield where there is no yield. And so when capital becomes a lot tighter, when people start retiring in the next decade, we're going to probably see Bitcoin's price fall off a cliff as scarce and more scarce capital starts chasing more real tangible investments. And the thing for Bitcoin too is that there's already plenty of countries that would debatably benefit from Bitcoin. Zimbabwe and Venezuela being the two biggest examples. And when you're in that sort of position, getting a hold of the basic technology to have Bitcoin as your reserve, that's not an obstacle if you're that desperate. But let's look at Venezuela, because I'm pretty familiar with Venezuela. What is Venezuela always trying to get a hold of? Gold, dollars, Chinese yuan. The Venezuelans have been in basically a 2-year legal battle with the English financial system, with the courts, in order to get hold of $2.1 billion worth of gold that are being held in English vaults. And they won that case recently. And they got that gold back. They flew it to Venezuela, and then they flew it off to Iran for political reasons. Um, and then every time Venezuela has the opportunity to sell its oil to the United States market, it does, because it needs dollars, and dollars are the only respectable reserve currency in this system, like regardless of what people say. And then China, who's continuously given the Venezuelans dollar loans, um, anytime if gold and dollars are unavailable, they get Chinese funding money, because the yuan basically has no value. It's monopoly money. And so when the Venezuelans are choosing Chinese yuan over Bitcoin, that is a huge case against Bitcoin. And if you're making the case that Bitcoin is fundamentally valuable and all these poorer nations would benefit from a stabler reserve than their own currencies, that exists right now in the system. It has existed in the system. As long as Bitcoin's been in the system, there has been a case for Bitcoin for being a reserve currency, but it hasn't materialized because the case isn't real. It's not real. Zimbabwe, I mean, geez, Zimbabwe, they completely dollar denominated their economy after the Zimbabwe dollar just completely fell apart. And only recently did they de-dollarize their system to return to a Zimbabwe dollar. And they're making progress to being a legitimate international currency again. But almost immediately, the Zimbabwe dollar, the new one, went from 1 to 1 to 1 to 7. And that $1 for every 7 Zimbabwe equivalent. And they need to do that for a bit in order for it to find some level of stability into where there's enough trust that institutions want to hold Zimbabwe dollars. But Zimbabwe has every incentive to hold Bitcoin if the case for Bitcoin that is made today is a legitimate case. The fact that they haven't says a lot. South Africa would benefit from the theoretical case for Bitcoin, but they're not doing it. Argentina, God, Argentina. What people just choose to do, the rich just choose to move and take their money with them. They go to Uruguay, or they go to the United States, where they can get dollars and protect themselves from the Argentine banking system. You don't see a migration to crypto. And every time there is a migration to crypto, it's just to be a middleman for them to get access to dollars. Tether, USDC, these sort of, it's legitimate. They're printing counterfeit dollars to keep the crypto system running. They're prime bank note creators under the Stable Act, which is being sort of tossed around in the House of Representatives. But even then, every time they try to create a system that is separate from the dollar always comes back in to dominate it. You can hate the dollar, but when it's the only option you have to love it too. So this idea that there's an alternative to the dollar, I think, is insane. Not a very popular opinion in current Real Vision circles, but that's what I'm seeing. And I'm an open-minded guy. My philosophy is that even if I believe something to my core, I want to be proven wrong. Because if being wrong is a path to a better solution, then I'm going to take that path, even if that means I have to take it at my ego, my dignity, and say I'm wrong. But I don't think I'm wrong here. I've done all the research and I'm just not convinced. So again, if you disagree with me, which you probably do, leave a comment below and I'd be happy to respond to it. And James, the question man, what do you have for me? Hey, John, excited for the new update. My questions: what are your thoughts on the current US military system? So I have to word this in a way that's not controversial or that can get me into trouble. And so to be politically correct, there's a lot of problems that need to be fixed. I have been in this process of trying to become an officer since August of 2019, and they just extended the possible window for boot camp dates for myself and my class to October of next year. And a lot of that has to do with incompetencies at the top in the Air Force. This isn't a executive level like presidential issue. It's strictly the bureaucracy. There isn't a special pipeline for new recruits to get the necessary physicals and medical work done. And so we're always last in line, even for enlisted people. And so our ability to get into the system and to get working really quickly is pretty poor. And when you're a volunteer system, you have to rely on the determination and patriotism of very smart, intelligent people for them to stay in the military, because the money in the private sector is so much better. You can work for the government of South Dakota and make $10,000 more working at an entry level position with them than you can get working for the military. And so they rely on a lot of goodwill to get new hires. And for me, I have become very burnt out on this process. Um, I went into this process being incredibly patriotic, and I still am. But I've started to question whether or not that's worth it. Mostly because there's a lot of us who feel like we've been left behind by the Air Force. The Navy, what a lot of people don't know is the Navy did a very considerable purge of their leadership and middle management in 2016 through 2018. That has led to fewer captains being deployed on ships, and so the Navy activity has been a lot slower. But they're doing all the right things to get new talent promoted, to get new people in, and to make sure that no one is getting stuck outside of the system. The Air Force needs to go through a similar process. And so if you're thinking about joining the military, I wouldn't do it. I'm looking for jobs so I can get out of my contract. And legally, I'm allowed to get out of my contract before I get on the plane to boot camp. But for someone like me who's wanted to be a military officer since high school, since sophomore year of high school, so that's almost 7 years ago. I've worked for this for almost a decade, and to have to be forced out against my will because I don't want to do this. But they're leaving me no choice. I can't be without a job for more than a year, and that's what they're asking me to do. And so, just don't do it. And that kills me to say it, because the military needs people. And so when you're asking me, is it improving or getting worse? What are recruiting numbers like at the moment and going forward? So it's not a clean one, like clear answer. The Navy's improving considerably. The Coast Guard has always been on their A game, as much as we like to roast the Coast Guard. The Marine Corps, being part of the Navy, has always had very competent leadership, and they did a similar purge as well, so they're doing the same thing. The Army has always been sort of a mixed bag, and that's just the Army. They're just being the Army. I don't think there's anything wrong, I don't think they're doing anything fundamentally wrong or fundamentally right. And then the Merchant Marine is like the little branch that no one knows about, and they always been pretty solid. They do all the training for most of the American Merchant Marine Force, both private and government owned, and they're pretty competent. They were actually on my list of places to apply for after high school, but I decided not to do it. But the Air Force has gotten considerably worse, and recruiting numbers show that. Recruiting across all the branches has been very low, mostly because the money in the private sector is more attractive. And the people they do bring in that are incredibly competent and incredibly smart and also incredibly patriotic tend to be burnt out by the military after their contract is over, so they don't stay in. The only way that problem could be solved is either they make a very dedicated push to clean house and reform a lot of the broken things that are in the system currently. And that's not likely to happen. So what you need to do is bring back conscription. But you start doing targeted conscription of intelligent people from institutions and promise them good pay and good benefits in trading their ability not to leave the process as what conscription dictates. That's a system I think that's going to need to be implemented, because reforming the Department of Defense has always been a non-starter. It's a state within a state. And so the only way you're able to do it is if you just sort of force feed them the talent and then force them to pay them at commensurate levels. And so that would be my idea of reform. Are we in that period of good times create weak men, or weak men create hard times, or hard times create strong men? I think the good times create weak men. There's a speech that Carter did, which is called Carter's Malaise speech, that talks about a lot of the things that we're seeing again in the early 2000s, or a lot of the things that Carter dealt with when he was president in the mid to late 70s. There's a feeling that American greatness is on a decline. It's almost a crisis of character. And I think that speech, despite how unpopular it was when it came out, I think it's fairly accurate at what it is today. Um, Life in America has become, for a lot of people, very hard, but for a lot of people, way too easy. And so there needs to be some sort of restoration of balance in the system where people who work hard get the rewards they deserve and people that don't work hard get what they deserve. And a lot of that in the current system has been turned upside down. And I think there needs to be a concerted move to change that. Do I have ideas that could fix that? Of course. But this video is getting fairly long, and that's probably a conversation for a different time and probably in private because there's a lot of ideas to go over there. But I do have a couple of policy ideas that would help fix that. Um, but yeah, those are my answers to my questions. The military one's probably going to surprise a lot of people, and it still surprises me because I've been going through this, um, like I said, for almost over a year now, and until July of this year, did it only start to get progressively worse, and so again, it saddens me. I wish it wasn't the case, but that's what I'm thinking and that's what I'm feeling. And so if you have any questions or you want to reach out to me in private and get those questions resolved, I'd be happy to do that. But let me close this out and stop the sharing. So I just want to thank you all for all your questions. I'll probably do this again in 2 weeks. And I just, again, the outpouring of support and contributions to this has always been amazing. And if you have any questions you'd like me to answer, leave them in the comments below or message me via the private message system on the exchange, and then we can trade numbers and switch to WhatsApp. I've already done that for Mr. Charts, for Jeremiah, and for Igor and a couple other people. And so again, my door is always open if you guys want to talk. And I hope all of you have a great upcoming week and happy trading. Cheers, guys.